So today is our 5th lecture, I guess, and our topic is anatomy, basic neuroanatomy. So we are going to talk about the parts of the brain, some kind about their functions, and so on. Unfortunately, last time I totally forgot about the test after the lesson. So after today's lesson, you will have 2 tests. First about the attention, and second about the neuroanatomy. Okay. So the topic is basic neuroanatomy, and we will have 4 parts. The first part is about some basic principles. The second part is about nervous system. The third part is about the brain itself. And the last part is about neocortex or the highest brain. The top figure shows a vertical midline front to back cut of the brain called sagittal. When brain images are recorded in the vertical plane, they go from one side of the brain across the midline between the 2 hemispheres of the onto the other side. And when the cut is exactly through the midline between the 2 hemispheres, like here, it's called mid-sagittal. The middle figure shows a horizontal or axial cut through the brain, and a series of horizontal cuts goes from the top to the bottom, so from here to here. And the lower figure shows a coronal or side-to-side section, a series of coronal sections named for its crown shape. We'll go from the forehead to the back head like a salami slice. And coronal section shows both hemispheres in cross section. If you have some trouble visualizing these sections, think of familiar objects like an automobile or a cake. So this is like different cuts, lengthwise, crosswise, or horizontal slices of this object. So on the left side of the brain, the left side shows major landmarks seen from the inside or medial division, also called mid-sagittal. This reveals the great valley between the 2 hemispheres. The corpus callosum is the bridge between the hemispheres. And the right side shows an outside or lateral viewpoint of the brain's left side. Notice that the brain is looking to the left in both figures. You should be able to identify which way the brain is looking and which plane of section you are seeing. But usually the brain is looking to the left, so the cerebellum is in the back side of the brain, and here you also can see the cerebellum. The lateralization of brain function is the tendency for some neural functions or cognitive processes to be specialized to one side of the brain or the other. The medial longitudinal tissue separates the human brain into 2 distinct cerebral hemispheres connected by the corpus callosum, as you can see here. Okay. Also, the macrostructure of the 2 hemispheres appears to be most identical different composition of neuronal networks allows for specialized functions that is different in each hemisphere. And lateralization of brain structures is based on general trends expressed in healthy patients. However, there are numerous counterexamples to each generalization. Each human's brain develops differently, leading to unique lateralization in individuals, and this is different from specialization, as lateralization refers only to the function of the structure divided between two hemispheres. And specialization is much easier to observe as a trend, since it has a strong anthropological history. But we will discuss the lateralization later at the lecture about thinking and imagination, I guess. The brain has grown and evolved from the inside out, much like a seed grows into a tree. And lower regions like the brainstem are generally more ancient than higher regions, such as the frontal cortex. Basic survival functions like breathing are controlled by neural centers in the lower brainstem, while the large prefrontal cortex in humans is a late addition to the basic mammalian brain plan. A trend in brain evolution, according to a study done with mice, chickens, monkeys, and apes, concluded that more evolved species tend to preserve the structures responsible for basic behaviors. And a long-term human study comparing the human brain to the primitive brain found that the modern human brain contains the primitive hindbrain region that most neuroscientists call the proto-reptilian brain. The purpose of this part of the brain is to sustain fundamental homeostatic functions. So the pons and medulla are major structure found there, and a new region of the brain developed in mammals about 250 million years after the appearance of the hindbrain. This region is known as the paleomammalian brain, the major part of which are the hippocampus and amygdalas, and they are often referred to as limbic system. The limbic system deals with more complex functions, including emotional, sexual, and fighting behaviors. And the area of the brain which is the greatest amount of recent evolutionary change is called the neocortex. And for example, in fish, this area is called the pallium, and it's smaller and simpler relative to body mass than what is found in mammals. And according to the research, cerebrum first developed about 200 million years ago, and it's responsible for higher cognitive functions, for example, language, thinking, and related forms of information processing. And it's also responsible for processing the sensory input together with thalamus, yes, and so on. And now let's talk about structure of the neurous system. So neurous tissue first arose in worm-like organisms about 550 to 600 million years ago. And in vertebrates, it consists of two main parts: the central nervous system, or CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. And the PNS consists mainly of nerves, which are enclosed bundles of the long fibers of axons that connect the CNS to every other part of the body. and nerves that transmit signal from the brain are called motor or efferent nerves, while those nerves that transmit information from the body to the CNS is called sensory or efferent nerves. Spinal nerves serve both functions and are called mixed nerves. The PNS is divided into three separate subsystems: the somatic, autonomic, and enteric nervous system. Somatic nerves mediate voluntary movements. The autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system is activated in cases of emergencies to mobilize energy, while the parasympathetic nervous system is activated when organism in a relaxing state. The enteric nervous system functions control the gastrointestinal system. I'll just leave this slide here for you, so you can remember the basic qualities of different nervous systems as you review the material. What needs to be remembered when we talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system is what effect do they have on the body. So sympathetic nervous systems primary process is to stimulate the body to fight or flight, so fight or flight response. And the sympathetic nervous system is described as being antagonist to the parasympathetic nervous system, which stimulates the body to feed and breathe and to rest and digest response. So messages travel through the sympathetic nervous system in a bidirectional flow. Efferent messages can trigger changes in different parts of the body simultaneously. For example, the sympathetic nervous system can accelerate heart rate, while bronchial passages decrease motility or movement or constrict body vessels, increase peristalsis, and so on. And the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for priming the body for action, particularly in situations that are connected with surviving. One example of this priming is in the moments before walking, in which sympathetic outflow spontaneously increases in preparation for actions. The effect of the parasympathetic nervous system is the opposite to the sympathetic, and it prepares the body to rest and digest food. To better remember which of the system is responsible for what, you can remember that the sympathetic is stress and parasympathetic is peace. Now we turn to the central nervous system, and as you remember, the central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. So the spinal cord functions primarily in the transmission of nerve signals from the motor cortex to the body and from the efferent fibers of the sensory neurons to the sensory cortex. It's also a center of coordinating many reflexes and contains reflex arcs that can independently control reflexes. It's also the location of groups of spinal interneurons that make up the neural circuits known as central pattern generators. These circuits are responsible for controlling motor instructions for rhythmic movements, such as walking. And the dorsal roots are efferents they receive sensory information from the skin, muscles, and visceral organs to be related to the brain. This is another useful slide for you, which contains basic information about the brain and spinal cord. So to remind it later during the test, for example. And now let's go through the neuroanatomy of the brain. So there are about 100 different structures and nuclei in the brain, and we will only talk about some of them. But in order to structure our perceptions, I'll begin by explaining the concept of triune brain. So this conception now is not widely used because of a lot of critics, but for me it's good for memorize some structures of the brain. So this is a model of the evolution of the vertebrate for brain and behavior proposed by the American physician and neuroscientist Paul MacLean. And MacLean originally formulated his model in 1960s and propounded it to the 1990s. And he published the book, The Triune Brain in Evolution. This brain consists of the reptilian complex, the paleomammalian complex, and the neomammalian complex or neocortex. And so paleomammalian complex means limbic system here. And viewed each as independently conscious and as structures sequentially added to the forebrain in the course of evolution. And this theory was criticized mostly because MacLean thought that every part of the brain has its own consciousness. So the aim of the first part, so of the reptilian complex, is surviving. So it has such functions as breathing. The most of the locomotion systems are connected with the brainstem and cerebellum, and the second part is referred to as mammalian brain or limbic system, because when animals live in a group, they need to feel something to each other, so they need emotion to live in a group. And so this is the aim of the limbic system according to MacLean. And humans, for example, they need to use their mind, and that's why they need all these higher functions connected with neocortex and so on. However, the most popular division of the brain into the HINDBRAIN and forebrain. And the brain and its parts can be divided into three main categories: the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. The forebrain or prosencephalon, the midbrain or mesencephalon, and hindbrain or rhombencephalon are the three primary brain vesicles during the early development of the neural system. So this division is connected with embryogenesis and yeah, so in some kind also with evolution. The hindbrain includes the medulla, here is the medulla, pons, and cerebellum. Oh, here also medulla, pons, and cerebellum. Together, they support vital bodily process. The medulla oblongata, or simply medulla, is a long stem-like structure which makes up the lower part of the brainstem. And the medulla contains the cardiac, respiratory, vomiting, and vasomotor centers, and therefore deals with the autonomic functions of breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure, as well as the sleep and wake cycle. And also here. The midbrain, or mesencephalon, is the forwardmost portion of the brainstem, and it is associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep and wakefulness, arousal or alertness, and temperature regulation. The principal regions of the midbrain are the tectum. Maybe you remember from the previous class about the attention. I showed you the picture with the frog, and I said that the frogs, they have some special kind of vision. I think here you can see this this picture. When they see something like fly, they just do some motor actions to this, and the same part human they have in the brain. So the tectum is some kind of ancient vision part of the brain, and the lower part is connected with auditory signals. Okay. So the tectum, consists of superior colliculus or optic tectum and inferior colliculus. And the history of investigation of the optic tectum has been marked by several large shifts in opinion. Before about 1970, most studies involved non-human, non-mammals, fish, frogs, birds, and so on, in which the optic tectum is the dominant structure that receives input from the eye. And the general view then was that the optic tectum in these species is the main visual center in the non-mammalian brain, and as a consequence is involved in the wide variety of behaviors. And behavioral studies have shown that the superior colliculus is not needed for the object recognition, but plays a critical role in the ability to direct behaviors towards specific objects, and can support this ability even in the absence of the cerebral cortex. And the inferior colliculus or lower hill is the principal midbrain nuclei for the auditory pathway, and it receives input from several peripheral brainstem nuclei in the auditory pathway, as well as inputs from the auditory cortex. The forebrain controls body temperature, reproductive functions, eating, sleeping, and the display of emotions. And forebrain has two parts, diencephalon and telencephalon. Here there are briefly outline the structures of the brain and the functions. They can use it later. And the brain builds on the brain stem with the thalamus on top as a major input hub of all sensory inputs. And the hippocampus and amygdala, in orange, are actually nested inside each of the temporal lobes, and the light blue ventricles, they have no neurons, but provide the brain's own circulatory system. The basal ganglia can be thought of as the output hub of the system, and a great deal of traffic flows back to the cortex as well. And so the white matter and neocortex is around all this stuff: basal ganglia, hippocampus, amygdala, ventricles, and of course thalamus and brainstem. So nerve fibers project out of the thalamus to the cerebral cortex in all directions, allowing hub-like exchanges of information. And it has several functions, such as relaying of sensory signals, including motor signals to the cerebral cortex, and the regulation of consciousness, sleep, and alertness. And for the visual system, for example, inputs from the retina are sent to the LGN, or lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, which in turn project to the visual cortex. And the thalamus is believed to both process sensory information as well as relay it. Each of the primary sensory relay areas receives strong feedback connections from the cerebral cortex. So in the cortex and thalamus are a massively interconnected system. Color coding shows the mapping of connections between cortical and thalamic regions. And the thalamus has many connections to the hippocampus, as well via the mammillothalamic tract. And the difference, for example, there is the difference between the thalamus and neocortex, because in neocortex there are a lot of recurrent connections. So if we take one small volume from neocortex, the neurons here are recurrently connected with each other, but in thalamus they are not connected with each other in each small volume. The limbic system is involved in mediating emotional response and memory, and it's made up of a number of different structures. Some of the most important ones are amygdala. It's involved in our experience of emotion, and it's involved in processing fear. Hippocampus is a structure. Here is the hippocampus. Structures associated with learning and memory, and in particular spatial memory. And hypothalamus regulates homeostatic processes, including body temperature, appetite, and blood pressure, and some other functions. The cerebral hemisphere are shown here. They are mounted above the brainstem and all the other subcortical bodies. And now let's move on to the anatomy of the cerebral cortex, the biggest part of the brain. So the two hemispheres are completely separate and divided by the longitudinal fissure at the top that runs between the two hemispheres from the anterior to the posterior part of the brain, and a schematic view of the two hemispheres showing some measured functions of the left and the right hemispheres. The corpus callosum is a white, thick nerve tract consisting of the flat bundle of commissural fibers, and it's the largest white matter structure in the brain, about 10 centimeters in length and consisting of 200 to 300 million axonal projections. And the symptoms of refractory epilepsy can be reduced by cutting through the corpus callosum in an operation known as a corpus callosotomy. Roger Sperry discovered the basic function of the corpus callosum due to such operations. So he conducted a series of split brain experiments working with his greatest student, Michael Gazzaniga, and Sperry invited several of the split brains patients to volunteer to take part in his study to determine if the surgery affected their functioning. So these tests were designed to test the patient's language, vision, and motor skills. When a person views something in the left visual field, that is on the left side of the body, the information travels to the right hemisphere of the brain and vice versa. In the first series of tests, Sperry would present a word to either the left or right visual field for a short period of time. And if the word was shown to the right visual field, meaning the left hemisphere would process it, then the patient could report seeing the word. So in this case, we ask the patient, so what word do you see? And he tell us the ring, because in the majority of population, the brain functions connected with the speech are connected with the left hemisphere. However, in a follow-up experiment, Sperry discovered that the right hemisphere does have some language abilities. Some language abilities. And in this experiment, he had the patients place their left hands in a tray full of objects located under a partition. So the patient wouldn't be able to see the objects. Then a word was shown to the patient's left visual field, which was processed by the right side of the brain. And this word described one of the objects in the tray. So the patient's left hand picked up the object corresponding to the word, like on the picture. And when participants were asked about the words and the objects in the hand, they claimed they hadn't seen the words and had no idea why they were holding an object. So the right side of the brain had recognized the word and told the left hand to pick it up. But because the right side of the brain cannot speak and the left side of the brain hadn't seen the words, the patient couldn't articulate what they had seen. Okay. And so this is about the functions of corpus callosum and the idea that hemispheres can live in their own life and due to corpus callosum, we have some communication between these hemispheres. And now let's move on to the geography of the brain. There are some directions of the brain, anterior or front, back or posterior, top or superior, and bottom or inferior. So we usually use the Latin words here. And the 4 major lobes of the brain are visible from a lateral view. So the frontal lobe is in purple, is an anterior. Parietal lobe, orange, is posterior to the frontal lobe. Temporal lobe, blue, is posterior to the frontal lobe and inferior to the parietal lobe. And occipital, yellow, is posterior to the both parietal and temporal lobes. And the green region at the posterior and inferior part of the brain is the cerebellum. Some important landmarks of the brain in the left hemisphere from a lateral perspective, left panel, and a mid-sagittal perspective, the right panel. For example, precuneus, cuneus, corpus callosum, as you remember, singular gyrus, which will be widely discussed later, hippocampal gyrus, which is connected with the hippocampus. What else? Central sulcus, which distinct the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and so on. And this is a Brodmann classification. So Brodmann areas were originally defined and numbered by the German anatomist Carbinian Brodmann, based on the architectonical organization of neurons, and he observed in the cerebral cortex using the Nissl method of the cell staining. Brodmann published his maps of cortical areas in humans, monkeys, and other species in 1909, so more than 100 years ago. So, along with many other findings and observations regarding to the general cell types and laminar organization of the mammalian cortex. So these different paintings are connected with different cell types in these parts of the brain, and that's why the brain is divided on different areas called as Brodmann areas. For example, one of the most popular and important parts of the brain is the Brodmann zone number 46, or dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The cerebral cortex is the largest site of neural integration in the central nervous system, and it plays a key role in attention, perception, awareness, thought, memory, language, and consciousness. So it can be broken up into 4 lobes, each with a different function in some way, but of course they work together. So if we want to locate the prefrontal cortex, so the most cognitive part of the brain, the frontal lobe lies anterior to the central sulcus. So this is the biggest sulcus. The 2 purple gyri or hills immediately in front of the central sulcus are called motor. Well, this is motor cortex and premotor cortex. And the reddish purple patch in front of that is called the supplementary motor cortex. This is supplementary motor cortex, and the 3 shades of yellow is the frontal third of the whole cortex. Is the prefrontal cortex, often considered the most cognitive part of the brain. The frontal lobe is the site for motor planning and motor output, but in humans, the frontal lobe, especially the prefrontal cortex, performs many other functions. So a little summary for you about the frontal lobe. I want to know where it first became clear what some of the functions of the anterior lobe of the brain are. So this was due to an accident in the mid of 19th century with Phineas Gage. So a metal rod hit his skull, as a result of which Phineas remains alive, but certain changes took place in his personality. He could no longer control himself as before. And so everyone understood that one of the main functions of prefrontal cortex is connected with the self-control, with some executive functions, and with the personality. As if the personality of Phineas Gage changed, so totally changed totally. The temporal lobe is posterior to the frontal lobe and inferior to the parietal lobe. And the temporal lobe contains auditory cortex, where sound is processed, as well as language reception and comprehension regions. The middle region of the temporal lobe are important to memory, and inferior posterior regions are involved in visual object representation. A couple more things to remember about the temporal lobe. So the first is that the auditory cortex is located here, so primary auditory cortex, the cortex which is responsible for processing auditory information. And the second is finding the Wernicke's and Brock zones, which are involved in the generation of speech. And Wernicke is more important for speech comprehension, and we need Broca's area to produce speech. The parietal lobe is posterior to the frontal lobe. The anterior portion of the parietal lobe contains somatosensory cortex. It's quite after the central sulcus. And the other parts of the parietal cortex are connected with multisensory integration. And the main sensory receptive area for the sense of touch in the somatosensory cortex, which is just posterior to the central sulcus, in the posterior gyrus, and the dorsal stream of the visual system. The sensory cortex and the motor cortex, they are organized topographically. So, for example, a homunculus or a little man shows the body map for motor representation of different areas of the body, and somatosensory representation of the different areas of the body. And note that some body areas, such as the fingers, have disproportionately larger representation that other body areas, such as the trunk and the close physical connection between motor cortex located just anterior to the central sulcus and the somatosensory cortex located just posterior to it allows for a tight coupling between the senses of touch, pressure, and pain and the action of motor system. The last part, last lobe, is the occipital lobe, and it's located at the posterior of the brain. It's a home of visual cortex, so the visual system occupies a large region of the occipital lobe that extends upwards to the parietal lobe and anterior to the temporal lobe, and it's organized retinotopically. So on the right picture, you can see the path of the visual sensory information. So from the eye, it goes to LGN, or lateral geniculate nucleus of thalamus, and then it goes to V1. It's a field in occipital lobe, and then it's processed in V2, V3, and also in 4. So there are, in fact, there are two streams of processing the visual information, but we'll go through it later. So the brain has developed and changed through the time, and some areas are older than other areas. The neocortex is the youngest part of the brain, and the frontal part of the brain is the youngest part of the whole cortex, and it's connected with the highest cognitive functions. And of course, we can separate some regions of the brain and some parts of the neocortex, but in fact they are connected between each other, and they can do their functions without each other. So this division is symbolical in some way, when we call that this part of the brain is responsible for for one function, and this part of the brain is responsible for another function. But that's all for today. So we mentioned the main items about the division of neurosystem, about the brain parts and the parts of the neocortex, and we will use it in our next lectures about thinking and imagination, and then about brain networks first, and then about thinking and imagination, and about the states of mind. So the next lesson, or the next class, will be in MIPT again, and I think we are going to have a kind of combined class, a small lecture, and then some other tasks with the devices. So that's all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
You too.